Okay, top 10 series list, part 2. This is 4 through 1, and the honorable mentions. No long preface, because we've already done the preface. If you want to see the preface and you haven't seen part 1, part 1's in the description. Or if you don't care about part 1 and you just want to watch 4 through 1, and you're like, screw those peasant 5th through 10th favorite series. That's too low. Like, I want the good stuff, then that's fine too. But if you complain that I didn't include a series that was in the first part, I will make fun of you. Number 4 is a series that over the last couple years I have maybe gotten a little bit lower on overall. It is still 4th, clearly. This is a series that inarguably has a lot of flaws. And also, it has a lot of quirks that are just called flaws by people who dislike it as the reason why it's objectively bad. But don't worry, they won't do that for the same series that they like. Despite all of these flaws and quirks, there is a bit of a gap between this series at number 4 and the rest of the list. 5 through 9, even 5 through 10 could have gone in a bunch of different orders, but from here on out, I do not really have doubts. These are definitely my 4 favorite series, and this is definitely the order in which I like them. If one were to look at my spreadsheet, this series would look very similar to the ones below it for almost everything. GPA looks comparable, mean and median look good, but not an outlier compared to the previous 6 series. The minimum is actually kind of low, and Q1 and Q3 look good, but similar to the previous 6. Where it really stands out is with the maximum, because this series has my book of the year from 2020 with a 9.8 out of 10, one of my 10 favorite books of all time, The Gathering Storm by Robert Jordan and Brandon Sanderson, and the series is The Wheel of Time. So let's just get it out of the way. The pacing is often somewhat suspicious. I'm looking at you, Crossroads of Twilight. The characters can be frustrating. There, that's been acknowledged. Now let's talk about the strength. Firstly, and most importantly for me, is the character arcs. In my opinion, the characters in The Wheel of Time do not instantly pop off the page to the extent of characters in, the Farseer trilogy, The First Law, or Song of Ice and Fire. But where basically no one can fuck with Wheel of Time is long-term development. So Rand al'Thor is the quintessential example here, because he's got his, 14-book character arc. But what makes it so good is that he has 10 character arcs that all are good on their own, and they get connected into one man, because that's how people work. We change in an uncountable number of small ways. And in every single book where he has substantial page time, he has significant changes to his personality, values, strengths, weaknesses, and beliefs. And critically, every one of those things changes in ways that would be both positive and productive ways, and also in negative and destructive ways, while also making sense and adding up for who he started as a character and who he's having to become. He is, in my opinion, easily the best character arc in the series, and probably has a case for the best character arc that I've ever read. But the series is full of brilliant character arcs. Many writers are known for character-driven plots, meaning that the conflict and story comes from who the characters are. This is not Robert Jordan's strength, in my opinion, but what he's really good at is the opposite. He makes plot happen, and then taking that plot and having it generate compelling character arcs and character development. The other obvious pro for Wheel of Time is setting, which got one of the few A pluses. It's basically an nearly unmatched, yes, Malazan fans, I said nearly, unmatched combination of scale and depth, also Tolkien fans, with vividly written unique cultures, very compelling lore and backstory, and just everything you could want in a fantasy series. I sometimes see 2 combinations of criticisms for the Wheel of Time together, and it just blows my mind that they don't notice that their 2 criticisms address each other. One is that the characters have strange tendencies and act in ways that they, the reader, find irrational. And 2, the cultures are just details and really made top down and not actually impacting who people are. But the characters are, of course, acting in those strange and irrational ways because they're written as if they've lived their entire life in an incredibly well-built culture. Often I think authors can fall in the trap of writing really well done cultures and then, like, making the tendencies that gives people for the NPCs, like the irrational viewpoints that don't make sense to us, the reader. That's not for the POV character. That's for the other people that we have to deal with. Not Robert Jordan. The peoples whose head we were in all have worldviews and values that directly impact how they act and see the world based on the culture that they've had a lived experience in. Now, the series lows do stop it from making it even higher, but The Wheel of Time is still one of my absolute favorite series, and sometimes I have to remind myself how insanely good some of the novels in there are, and as a result, it earns my 4th favorite complete series in the world. Sometimes I feel I read something where one element or storyline is so overwhelmingly incredible that I start to forget how still very, very good everything else is. My 3rd favorite complete series has a plotline like this. It contains dozens and dozens of characters, countless plots and subplots, but there is one in particular that just sticks. Centered around one of my favorite characters of all time, and I can't even tell you their damn name because I kind of think it is a spoiler and changes how people read the earlier books if they know this character is the type of character to be my favorite character in the series by far. However, I need to remember that that plotline is not all this series is. But fortunately, all the rest kicks ass as well. This is one of the more difficult series to recommend because book 1 is so different from book 2, which is then quite different from books 3 and 4. Despite that, The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu lands this spot pretty comfortably as my 3rd favorite complete series. Many authors have multiple series in the same world. Baker, Pierce Brown, Joe Abercrombie, and very often the second series is the more beloved one. Ken Liu basically did the equivalent of sticking that entire first series into one 600-page novel, creating a very sweeping, zoomed-out book that I really enjoyed, but can be hard to recommend for fans of what would be a more traditionally paced and told epic fantasy. For book 1, I would say the plotting, world building, and theme is what stood out, as it managed to maintain coherence, logic, and consistent pacing in an incredibly eventful and zoomed out series, while giving a taste of the fantastic character work that was to come. However, the dialogue is brief, not much time is spent on internal monologue, and many of the villains are somewhat straightforwardly terrible. Contrast that even with the first half of Wall of Storms, which is a character-driven, political thriller with some truly phenomenal character work, and then finally Speaking Bones, which is some of the best character work and exploration of theme that I have ever read, with one of the most complex, unique, and utterly fascinating characters taking central stage, surrounding by a cast where every character has depth. Well, every character except one, but everyone gets a mulligan. However, one could note that the plotting of Veiled Throne is arguably a bit messy and unfocused. Overall, this gives a strange combination where for each category of GPA, at least one book is incredible. And the combination of excellence at everything at some point in the series makes the Dandelion Dynasty look like the first outlier from the pack on my spreadsheet. First off, I gave this series straight A's for GPA. I gave it an A+ in theme, as I think it had some of the most nuanced and impactful exploration of themes that I've ever read. And I nearly gave it an A+ for setting, as Dara is a sprawling, deep, original, living world. However, I felt it was a tiny step behind the A+ for setting. Speaking Bones on its own would get the 3rd A+ in characters, but Grace of Kings, being relatively weaker, but in my opinion still quite good, drops it a touch, so I couldn't quite give it an A+. And it's the opposite for plot, where I think Wall of Storms and Grace of Kings are clearly an A+, and then Veiled Throne and Speaking Bones are slightly less tight, and so drop it to an A. To measly an A. And then Ken Liu gets an easy A for prose, which didn't blow my mind in Grace of Kings, but by Wall of Storms already stood out as just outstandingly written, and it somehow kept getting better and better. This overall gave it a GPA of 4.0, actually 4.04, which is a pretty clear step up from everything before it, and it also looks like a pretty clear step up looking at the book-by-book scores. However, for me, it wasn't second or first in any category. It was just third to sixth at everything, which is what held it back from being 2 or 1. Well, really what held it back from being 2 or 1 is that I like the other two series more, but when I filled out my spreadsheet, that was reflected in that way. So for fans of political fantasy with epic battles, incredibly nuanced themes, incredibly morally complicated and psychologically unique characters, with a vivid setting, it is hard to go wrong with The Dandelion Dynasty by Ken Liu. Just brilliant. The great events of an age appear to those living through them as backdrops, only to the vastly more compelling dramas of their own lives. And how could it be otherwise? In this same way, many of the men and women there in the Hippodrome, and some who were not, but later claimed to have been, would cling to one private image or another of what transpired. They might be entirely different things, varying moments, for each of us has strings within the soul, and we are played upon in different ways, like instruments. And how could it be otherwise? There's only one thing that could hold back this series from being on this list, and that is that it could arguably be considered a standalone. This series has a chapter that is about a chariot race. It isn't a chariot race for the fate of the world. The stakes of the chariot race are that the winner gets to win the chariot race. Sound kinda indulgent? It is one of the most singularly incredible chapters I have ever read. It's kind of hyperbole, but reading and then later rereading that chapter was maybe a spiritual experience. Every single page, its own unique work of art. And on paper, the Sarantine Mosaic by Guy Gavriel Kay looks like it should be number 1. It'll have to settle for second, though. It is, when you look at this on my spreadsheet, first in mean, it's tied for first in median, it's tied for first in max, it's first in minimum rating, it's first in Q1, and it's first in Q3, and it has the highest GPA. At first, I had Guy Gavriel Kay as like the A+ student who got a B in PE because I had him at a B in action. And then I thought about it and I was like, hey, chariot races are action scenes, right? So yeah, he gets straight A's and a GPA of 4.1. It's actually in some ways unfair how good this series is. I don't only struggle to find weaknesses, I struggle to find a relative weakness. Where if you ask me hey, what's the worst thing about the Sarantine Mosaic? I'm like, now I'm thinking about it and I literally don't know. It is my number 1 pick in prose for any story ever. Just truly beautifully written, in my opinion, without being overly dense or difficult as well. It has a huge cast of characters that hops all over the place in terms of people's head, and also it has non-linear storytelling all the time, and it doesn't have a character list, and I basically never struggled to remember who anyone was throughout the entire duology, just due to how naturally everything was communicated and how compelling every character was. I started with the quote from what might be my favorite page in fiction because I think it sums up the spirit of this novel, which is based around an empire going through world-changing events that will ripple out through time and the world for millennia. And it spends just as many pages on that as it does on people who are just living there as the background characters to history who you will not find written about. Cooks, dancers, artists, doctors, senators in a Senate that is completely broken. And they are all exactly equally compelling as the stories of rising and falling empires, of conflicts of faiths and religions. Genius. This series also, I think, illustrates the difference between setting and world building and why they're not interchangeable as categories. It doesn't necessarily have thousands of years of history or lore, but what it has is a setting that is an integral part of the story and characters. It's not simply there. People living in it, it affects how they think and see the world compared to if they lived somewhere else. So the only reason this isn't 1 and why it's 2 is just it is. I like the series above it more. I don't need a reason. And actually, I'm going to be completely honest, it wasn't that close. Even if this was pretty comfortably second, some things can't be explained with numbers. However, this is still one of the most absurdly good stories I have ever read, and it's one I think about really, really often. There's always another secret. What a great tagline. Just missing out in the top 10 because of the late edition of Soldier Son is the first adult fantasy series I ever read, and therefore the books I read the youngest of any series in this video, or the previous video. When I wrote this, I didn't know it'd be two. Coming in as the only series on either list without a B in prose or characters, it still gets here through absolutely incredible plotting and setup and payoff, as well as just pure fun. It is, of course, Mistborn, and I have it labeled as a 7-book series, not just a trilogy, but I like the first trilogy more. Yeah, I know, it's not the most original choice, blah, 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 whatever. Booktubers always have the same series. I know, but you know what? Take it up with 14-year-old me. It's not my fault that the guy who was my favorite author also became the most successful. It'd be like that sometimes. This would arguably make the list if it was just the first trilogy, in spot number 10, and it could very easily be 11th or 12th as an honorable mention, but I kind of have it as the first honorable mention. I was basically a coin flip. I switched between this Greenbone Saga, which I had at 10, and the other honorable mention I'm about to go like 6 times. The Final Empire, yes, the novel is called The Final Empire, not Mistborn. It's The Final Empire. I refuse to change the title of that book because marketing thinks that people can't possibly figure out that book 1 in a series can have the word final in it. Whatever. It made me know that fantasy is my favorite genre. I was in 9th grade, and I would read random things, and very inconsistently, and I didn't know what genre was my favorite, and then I picked up The Final Empire, and I was like, I want more of that. Of all the series I have read, still, very few have as engaging mysteries for me due to the combination of being invested in finding the answers due to their connection to the stakes, and just for how well they're plotted and hinted at. I think it's basically possible to figure out everything, and I think it's really cool that despite the situation in all 3 books being very desperate, that if I could teleport into book 1 to help the protagonist, if we were able to communicate, I could like guide them to a resolution. I could solve most of their problems just with the amount of information I have, and how important that information is, and how connected it is, the lore is to the story. And despite being really figure-outable, 3 books straight, Brandon repeatedly blew my mind multiple times. As the tagline says, the trick is to never stop looking. There's always another secret. I probably would have figured out more if I read it now, but I didn't read it now, so who knows. Overall, I mean, it's Mistborn. I still love it, and I think it holds up pretty damn well. But the days of it being in the same tier, or like one of the first series I think of when you ask me what are my favorite series ever, are gone. But not because my love for it has diminished, but just because the competition has become more stiff. And the second honorable mention I have is The First Law by Joe Abercrombie, which I am considering to be one big 10-book series. This series was also in the 3-way dice toss with the Greenbone Saga and Mistborn. I originally had it at 10, then I changed my mind, and then I changed my mind again, and then I read Soldier's Son, and that knocked it down to 12, but it's like, they're interchangeable. The First Law was a hard series for me to grade, because some things, like for the GPA, like some things for the pacing, I think it goes from being reasonably poor in the first book to like fantastic in the last trilogy. But generally speaking, fantastic characters is true throughout, and vivid writing is true throughout, and good enough that it keeps it in contention with the series above it. I remember commenting 200 pages into The Blade itself that nothing has really happened, all the point of view characters are assholes, and the main antagonist of stairs. Oh yeah, I'm really enjoying it. The thing that holds me back from reading The First Law is it's, for me, not a particularly emotional read. I find the characters very engaging, and I'm very rarely bored, but I don't think I came close to like crying throughout the series, and I also didn't feel the same sense of triumph that can come from other stories I'm truly emotionally engaged in. Still though, this series has 5 books at 5 stars on Goodreads, which is one of the highest of any of these series on here. Especially when he's in trilogy mode, I just love me some Abercrombie. We're going to not talk about Best Served Cold. This is a positive video. And the last honorable mention on here is an honorable mention for a very different reason. And it's The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. If you're now mad at me for not having mentioned this and thinking I have it at 13, that's not the case. I like this enough, and I think it's good enough that it would be on the top list. But it's not a series. As you can see, it's a book. This is the entire Lord of the Rings in one book. It's got one title. See my top 10 standalone novel list if you want to see me talk about The Lord of the Rings. But yeah, it didn't miss out due to how much I like it. It didn't qualify. If you've watched any of my videos before, you saw this coming. I think it is basically impossible to write relationships between characters that are actually as complex as the relationships real people have with other real people. This author and this series is why I have to add a basically to that last sentence I said. If you look at the GPA I have here, this series looks lower than some of the others, especially the Serentine Mosaic. But that's because there are two types of A+. Imagine two 5th grade science projects. One does as well as you could possibly expect a 5th grader to do, follows all the criteria, the presentation is all correct, and it's just really good, and you basically have nothing wrong with it as a grader. A+. Then you look at the next 5th grade science project, and they just created a united theory of physics that explains relativity and quantum mechanics. Well, I guess that's also an A+, but those are not the same. Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb gets an A+ in characters. You can guess what type of A+ it is compared to the others. In my opinion, Robin Hobb is the only person I have read who has managed to fully capture that every person is a slightly different person depending on who they are interacting with. The version of me that my parents know is a different person than who my sister knows, who is a different person than who my friends know, who is a different person from who you all know. Which is also true of all Robin Hobb's characters, and captured so unbelievably and perfectly for what are some very abnormal relationship dynamics. Not saying other authors don't do this, I just think Robin Hobb captures this aspect of humanity on a different level from everyone else I have read. Like others of my favorites, I believe that reading it has broadened my knowledge of humanity and the human condition, and that it has maybe more than any other series made me a better person while compelling me the entire way. This obviously wasn't a shock to anyone. Y'all know how I feel about this. If I were to make a top 10 favorite books ever, no Robin Hobb, and a top 10 favorite Robin Hobb books, the second video would contain books that on average I like more. And if I were to make a top 10 favorite Realm of the Elderlings characters, it would produce a list of characters I like more than my 10 favorite non-Realm of the Elderlings characters. Realm of the Elderlings has a lot of books, but still, it doesn't just beat the field for me, it beats the field combined. So yes, on paper, Serentine should be first, but in reality, it was always going to be this series made of sub-series, Realm of the Elderlings, and I'm not even gonna bring up the numbers. Alright, there you go, that's the list. I think my cat has just been big chillin' for the last couple to show her approval of my top 2. So I want you to know that if you disagree in the comments, you're disagreeing with my cat, not only with me. Yeah, let me know what you thought of the top 10. Are any of these on the TBR? Do you also love them? Am I crazy? Are you going to ask about what's going on with me having numbers and then ignoring it, and I'll make fun of you for not going back and watching the intro of the first one when I told you that that would happen? Who knows? But the comments are, I do really like reading all your comments, so let me know what you think. Have a good day, everyone.